The PA cycled again. Aishe held still against the wall, close enough to the speaker grate that the vibrations tickled the fine hair on her temple. She did not lean into it. Leaning was movement, and movement meant the system might register her proximity as a behavioral event. She had learned that on the second day, or what she thought was the second day. Time was feeding cycles here, and she had counted 11. The announcement played, flat tones, that genderless machine voice, the same 12-word string it had been repeating at regular intervals since the alarm went quiet. She mouthed along, containment, secure, cycle, standard response, alert. The verb for move, it came in 2 conjugations, and she had spent 3 feeding cycles distinguishing them, one for cargo, one for personnel. The difference was a tonal shift on the second syllable, barely perceptible if you weren't listening for it. She was always listening for it. 40 words? She glanced down at the strip in her hand, a piece of cell-bed material she'd peeled free and flattened, scored with marks made by the sharp edge of a food packaging seal. 40 words arranged in clusters by function, nouns for things the ship cared about, verbs for things the ship did to those things, modifiers that seemed to indicate status or urgency. Containment, secure, cycle. The verb for move, it has 2 forms, one for cargo and one for personnel. I learned both. I am learning which one I am. The thought carried no bitterness. Bitterness was a luxury that required time and safety, and Aishe had neither. What she had was a strip of writing surface, a growing vocabulary, and a skill she'd carried since she was old enough to listen, older actually. She'd been listening before she had words for what she heard. Her mother's people moved through lands where 5 languages lived in the space of a day's walk, and the ones who survived were the ones who could hear the shape of a new tongue and start building inside it before the speaker finished the first sentence. The Combine's language was no harder than Hungarian. In some ways easier, it had been designed to be parsed by labor that was never meant to understand it fully. Simple grammar, repetitive structures, no poetry, no idiom, no wordplay. A language built for compliance. That was its weakness. The PA cycled again, same string. She caught a word she'd been uncertain about, manifest, or something close to it, a noun that appeared alongside the words for cargo and cycle and standard. She scored it onto her strip, adding a mark to indicate uncertainty. 41. The sound came through the wall, through the actual wall, the composite panel that formed the rear boundary of the holding bay. Aishe had been aware of it for some time. She didn't parse it mechanically, the way the young dark-skinned woman would have, reading frequency and resonance. But she didn't read it spatially, the way the woman with the watchful eyes would have, interpreting it as a change in terrain. Aishe heard it as a living thing. That breathing is not a human being, the rhythm is wrong, the depth is wrong. It has been there for a while. She pressed her palm flat against the panel. The composite was cool, slightly textured, and it conducted vibration better than it conducted heat. The breathing was deeper than anything in the holding bay. Longer inhale, longer exhale, a pause between cycles that no human lung would produce, too long, too even, as if the respiratory system had been designed for a thicker atmosphere or a slower metabolism. And there was a secondary rhythm underneath it, faint and regular, like a second pulse layered beneath the first. 2 systems, something with 2 respiratory systems, or 1 system and something else, a circulatory sound maybe, or a muscular rhythm she had no framework for. It had changed when the cell alarm went off. She was sure of that. The breathing had quickened, and then this was the part that mattered. It had slowed again. Deliberately, whatever was on the other side of this wall had heard the alarm, reacted, and then controlled its reaction. That was a thinking response. I moved along the wall, one hand trailing the surface, feeling for changes in the composite. The panel sections were uniform, gray, identical, sealed at the joints with a flexible gasket material that had the consistency of hardened resin. The construction was competent and old. Everything on the ship was competent and old, built to last, built to contain, built by people who had stopped thinking about whether the design was optimal because it had worked for long enough that the question seemed irrelevant. Her fingers found the gap, lower than she expected, near the floor, at a joint where two panel sections met. The gasket had separated, or had never fully sealed, or had been worn away by the vibration of the ship's engines over however many years this vessel had been running its routes. The opening was perhaps 6 centimeters wide and ran horizontally for the length of her forearm, too narrow to crawl through, enough to see. She went to her knees, then flat on her belly, cheek against the cold deck, one eye pressed to the gap. The light was different. That was the first thing. A blue-green wash, cooler than the sodium orange of the human hold. The same institutional quality, the same flat industrial coverage, but a different spectrum, calibrated for different eyes. The Combine had bothered to adjust the lighting for its cargo, and the fact that it had done so had cared enough about optimal containment conditions to match the light to the species was somehow worse than if the holds had all been identical. It meant someone had filed a specification, someone had reviewed it, someone had approved the purchase order for different bulbs. The hold on the other side was larger than the human bay, or shaped differently, harder to tell from floor level through a 6-centimeter gap. The surfaces were the same gray composite, the same sealed joints, but the cell furniture was wrong. Too tall, too narrow, configured for bodies that did not sit the way human bodies sat. 3 figures. Aishe's breath caught, and she held it, and she watched. They were standing, or what passed for standing, given that their limbs articulated differently than hers. 3 joints in each leg where a human had 2, which gave them a stance that looked coiled, even at rest, like something perpetually ready to change direction. Their skin, if it was skin, caught the blue-green light and scattered it in iridescent patterns, dark scales that shifted through emerald and cobalt and deep bronze as they moved. Not feathers, not fur, something harder and more precise, like overlapping ceramic tiles that happened to be alive. Their heads were proportionally smaller than a human head, but their eyes were not. The eyes were large and segmented, not compound like an insect's, but sectioned like a kaleidoscope lens that had been divided into rings. Each ring seemed to focus independently. When the nearest figure turned its head, Aishe could see the rings adjusting, contracting, and expanding in sequence, and she understood with absolute certainty that it was looking at the gap. Looking at her, it had been looking at the gap before she had arrived. It had been waiting. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Aishe on her belly on the cold deck, one eye pressed to the gap, the figure on the other side, standing in its coiled spring posture, those segmented eyes tracking her with a precision that made the back of her neck prickle. Then one of the other 2 shifted, a lateral step, smooth and silent, and made a sound, low, tonal, with harmonics that suggested more than one vocal channel operating simultaneously. Their own language, not the Combine's. The nearest one answered without looking away from the gap. The same layered quality. A brief exchange, 2 sounds, a pause, 1 sound, then silence. Aishe understood none of the words. She understood all of the meaning. It's one of the others. It's watching us. What do? We wait. The hand is the right gesture. It is always the right gesture. An open hand, not a weapon, not a claim. That is all it is. She knew the thought was irrational. She knew that the gesture meant nothing to a species she had never seen before, from a world she couldn't name, with a physiology that might not even register the difference between an open hand and a closed one. Where she knew that, she also knew that her grandmother had walked into 6 different villages where her people were not welcome and had survived every one of them. And the first thing her grandmother did every time was show her open hands. Aishe slid her right hand through the gap. The composite edge scraped her wrist. The air on the other side was different, cooler, slightly more humid, carrying a faint scent that was mineral and sharp, like wet stone. Her hand emerged into the blue-green light, and she held it there, palm up, fingers open, completely still. Nothing happened. Her shoulder began to ache from the angle. The deck was cold against her chest. She could hear her own heartbeat, and underneath it, the alien breathing, closer now. The nearest figure had moved, and she couldn't see it because her eye was no longer at the gap. Her hand was occupying the space her eye had used. She held the position. Something touched her fingertips. A touch, light, exploratory, tracing the edge of her index finger from nail to first knuckle. The texture was smooth and hard and warm, like sun-baked clay, and there were too many points of contact for a five-fingered hand. 6, maybe 7, each one articulating independently, mapping the shape of her hand the way a reader's fingers map a face. Then the grip closed. Firm, careful, something strong, choosing to be gentle. The fingers wrapped around her hand and held, and the pressure was even and deliberate, and Aishe felt the secondary pulse she'd heard through the wall, a slow, deep rhythm transmitted through the contact, alive in a way that was completely alien and completely recognizable. I am here. You are here. We are both here. She closed her fingers around the grip and held back. The vocabulary exchange took time. Aishe pulled her hand back, repositioned her eye at the gap, and began. She pointed at herself, said the combine word for cargo. The nearest figure watched, then pointed at itself and repeated the word. Same pronunciation, slightly different tonal emphasis. They had learned it from different speakers or from different PA systems calibrated for different hearing. She said containment. They said containment. She said cycle. They said cycle. She said secure, and they said something different, a combine word she hadn't cataloged, close to secure but with an additional modifier. She scored it onto her strip, 30 words on her side, roughly 30 on theirs. Different 30, but overlapping in the middle where the combine's operational language was universal. 3 combined words from the other side. A pause, then 2 more. Route, she knew that one. Secure door. She knew both of those words separately, but hadn't heard them combined. The third word, she didn't have it. She held up her hand, palm out. Again, they repeated. She shook her head. The figure tried a different construction. 2 words she did know, rearranged. Down, through, a route, a secure door, down and through. The floor, they were talking about a path through the floor. An access corridor, maybe, or an engineering sublevel that connected to their hold but not to the human bay. She pointed down. They confirmed a single combine affirmative that she recognized because the PA used it in containment status announcements. She pointed at the gap between them, at the wall. She used the combine word for open. The response was immediate. All 3 of them, in unison, the same combine word. Yes. Aishe rolled to her feet, brushed the deck line from her front, and walked back to where the others were staging. The broad man with the scarred arms was near the entrance, positioned where he could watch the corridor. The one with the soldier's bearing and the patient eyes stood with the woman who read spaces like landscapes, both of them studying the ceiling conduits. The thinker watched from near the wall, and his eyes tracked Aishe as she approached. And as she saw in his expression confirmation of a theory he'd already built, he had already suspected there were other cargo types. Aishe stopped in the middle of the group. She waited until they were looking at her, all of them, including the young dark-skinned woman who had been examining the cell mechanisms and now straightened up with a toolkit expression that Aishe recognized even across centuries and languages. What now? Aishe pointed at the wall. Alive, she said. 1 word, the first combined word she used deliberately with the group. The sound of it landed differently from the PA announcements. It came from a human throat, shaped by human intent, and every person in the bay understood it because the word carried its own translation in the way she pointed, in the direction of her gaze, in the weight of what she was telling them. She held up her strip, pointed at the wall again, used gesture, 2 hands, one human-shaped and one trying to approximate what she'd felt, the too many-fingered grip, the coiled posture. She traced the shape of the segmented eyes. She pointed down at the floor. Then she spoke directly, mixing gesture with the combined words she had and letting them carry what they could. I know about 30 of their words. They know about 30 of mine. It's enough to know they won out, and they know a door we don't. The soldier's eyes narrowed. Tactical recalculation, visible and immediate. The thinker's chin dipped fractionally. The young woman stepped forward. Her voice was fast, direct, already building toward the next question before the current one was fully answered. What are they? Like what kind of? Are they dangerous? Culpful? Aishe looked at her. The question was practical and reasonable and came from genuine concern, and Aishe answered it the only way that mattered. Their cargo. The young woman's mouth opened, closed. She nodded once, and the nod contained an entire reorganization of assumptions. Then she was moving, crossing the bay to the wall, dropping to her knees, pressing her face to the gap. The blue-green light played across her features as she studied the other side, and Aishe watched her hands come up to frame the opening, fingers testing the panel edges, the gasket material, the structural join. The young woman's fingers found the panel strut, the load-bearing element that held the composite sections in alignment. She traced it, gripped it, looked at the fastening mechanism with the expression of someone who had just been handed a problem she was specifically built to solve. "This I can do," she said. She looked up at Aishe, then at the rest of them, and her hands were already on the strut, already calculating force and leverage and the structural tolerance of composite that had been installed by workers who expected it to contain things less stubborn than this. "This is going to be loud,"